Frank Sullivan sat on the edge of his worn-out armchair, the springs creaking beneath his weight. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp perched on a side table cluttered with old photographs, a pocket watch, and medals that had long since lost their shine. The faint hum of a radio played an old country song, its lyrics fading in and out as if whispering secrets from another time. His eyes lingered on the framed photo of his late wife, Margaret, her warm smile frozen in time. He reached out and touched the glass, his calloused fingers tracing the outline of her face. "I still miss you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been that way for years. Frank had grown used to the silence, but sometimes, especially on nights like this, it felt heavier than usual. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back in Europe, crouched in a foxhole with Joe Carter, his best friend and brother-in-arms. The sound of gunfire rang in his ears, the smell of smoke and dirt filling his nose. A knock at the door jolted him back to the present. He frowned. No one ever knocked at this hour. Rising slowly, his knees protested with each step toward the door. When he opened it, his heart sank. A group of 5 men stood on his porch, their leather jackets adorned with patches and skull emblems. The leader, a tall man with greasy blonde hair and cold eyes, leaned against the doorframe. "You Frank Sullivan?" the man asked, his voice low but sharp. Frank squared his shoulders. "Who's asking?" The man grinned, revealing a row of crooked teeth. "Name's Billy Reynolds. My boys and I like this place. Think we'll make it ours." Frank's jaw tightened. "This is my home. Always has been. Always will be." Billy's grin widened as he stepped closer. "Not for long, old man. You got a week to pack up and get out." The others laughed, the sound echoing through the empty street. Frank's hand tightened around the door handle, but he said nothing. Billy leaned in closer. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "We'll be back," he said before turning and walking away, his gang following like wolves in the night. Frank stood frozen at the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. He locked it and stumbled back into the living room, sinking into his chair. His hands trembled as he reached for the drawer of the side table. He pulled out an old leather wallet, flipping through faded pictures until he found it, a crumpled piece of paper with a phone number scrawled in blue ink. He stared at the number for a long moment. Joe Carter. His brother-in-arms. They hadn't spoken in years, but Joe had once promised, "If you ever need me, I'll be there." Frank swallowed hard and picked up the phone. His fingers hesitated over the numbers before finally dialing. Ring. 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 "Hello?" The voice on the other end was female. Young but steady. "Ah, is this Joe Carter's number?" Frank asked, his voice cracking. There was a pause. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Joe passed away 2 years ago. I'm his daughter, Emily." "Who's this?" Frank's throat tightened. "Frank Sullivan. We served together." Another pause. Then her voice softened even more. "I remember hearing about you. My dad spoke highly of you." Frank swallowed the lump in his throat. "Emily, I need help." Her tone shifted immediately, sharp and attentive. "What's going on?" Frank looked out the window. The motorcycles were still parked down the street, their chrome reflecting the dim light of the lampposts. "Some men. They're trying to take my home." There was no hesitation in her response. "I'm on my way." Frank set the phone down, his heart racing, not with fear, but with something else. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Frank sat in his armchair, staring at the phone. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it back on the receiver. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but Emily's voice echoed in his ears, firm, confident, and full of purpose. He looked out the window again. The motorcycles were gone, but the silence they left behind felt more ominous than their presence. He clenched his jaw, pushing back the fear creeping in. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the low rumble of engines broke the stillness outside. Frank tensed, his body stiffening out of instinct. He peered through the curtain and saw a different sight this time, a line of motorcycles, but these ones moved with purpose, their riders disciplined and deliberate. Emily Carter was the first to dismount. She removed her helmet, revealing sharp features and piercing green eyes that scanned the area like a soldier assessing a battlefield. Her dark hair was tied back, and she wore a leather jacket adorned with military patches. Behind her, 5 other riders followed suit, all exuding the same quiet strength. Frank opened the door before she reached it. "Emily?" She extended her hand. "Frank Sullivan? It's an honor to meet you." Frank shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. "You came fast." Emily gave him a reassuring smile. "You don't leave family behind." Her words hit him hard. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Come in," he finally said, stepping aside. The group entered, their presence filling the small living room. Emily's team set down helmets and surveyed the space without a word, their movements precise and purposeful. Frank felt a strange comfort in their quiet competence. Emily studied the broken window and scuff marks near the door. "These guys mean business," she said. "But so do we." Frank cleared his throat. "I don't want anyone getting hurt over this." Emily turned to face him, her expression serious. "You asked for help. That means you're not giving up, and neither are we. Now tell me everything." Frank recounted the encounter with Billy Reynolds and his gang. He described their threats and the way they carried themselves, like men who had done this before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Emily listened intently, occasionally glancing at her team. When he finished, she nodded. "We're not dealing with amateurs," she said. "Billy Reynolds has a reputation. Drugs, extortion, and intimidation. But he's also sloppy, relies too much on fear and not enough on strategy." Frank frowned. "You've dealt with people like this before?" Emily gave him a knowing look. "Let's just say my time in the Marines didn't exactly prepare me for quiet suburban life. My team and we handle situations others can't." Frank exhaled slowly. "I didn't know who else to call." "Well, you called the right person." Emily's eyes softened. "And we're going to make sure you keep your home." Her confidence steadied him. For the first time in days, Frank felt like the odds weren't stacked entirely against him. "First things first," Emily continued. "We need to show these guys they picked the wrong target. My crew will take shifts watching the property tonight. Tomorrow, we'll reinforce this place." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Reinforce?" "We'll secure the perimeter. Motion sensors, floodlights, basic defenses." She grinned. "And maybe a few surprises. They'll think twice before coming back." Frank chuckled despite himself. "You sound just like your father." Emily's expression softened. "He always said you were the toughest man he knew." Frank looked away, the memory of Joe's voice echoing in his mind. "He'd be proud of you," Frank said quietly. Emily swallowed and nodded. "Let's make him proud together." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of movement. Emily's team brought in equipment from their motorcycles, ropes, chains, and tools Frank didn't recognize but trusted in their hands. As night fell, one of Emily's men, a broad-shouldered biker named Travis, took the first watch outside while the others prepared sleeping arrangements in Frank's living room. Frank sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. Emily pulled up a chair beside him. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Too many memories," Frank replied. She nodded. "I know the feeling." They sat in silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "Frank, I need you to understand something. Tomorrow, we're going to push back, but this doesn't end with one fight. Billy and his men will come again, and they'll come harder. You need to be ready for that." Frank straightened in his chair. "I've faced worse." Emily smiled. "Good. Because we're going to need that fire." Outside, Travis's silhouette stood against the moonlight, his figure steady and unmoving. Frank let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The morning sunlight crept through the tattered curtains, casting long shadows across Frank's living room. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Emily stood in the kitchen, pouring a cup for Frank. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "You're going to need this." Frank took the cup, his hands steady despite the restless night. Outside, the sound of drills and hammers echoed as Emily's team worked to fortify the property. Frank sipped the coffee and looked out the window. Travis and another biker named Jake were installing motion sensors along the fence line. A third, Melissa, was testing a spotlight mounted near the porch. "You all seem to know what you're doing," Frank said, impressed. Emily smirked. "We've had practice. After Dad passed, I took over his club, cleaned it up and turned it into something better. Now we ride to protect people who can't protect themselves." Frank's gaze lingered on her. He'd be proud. Emily's smile faded slightly, but she straightened her shoulders. "Let's make sure we give him something to be proud of." Outside, Frank stepped onto the porch and watched the team work. Emily joined him, leaning against the railing. "They'll be back," Frank said quietly. "They always come back," Emily replied. Frank glanced at her. "What's your plan when they do?" Emily's eyes hardened. "We hold the line." As if on cue, Travis approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Perimeter's secure. Sensors are live, and the spotlights are operational," he reported. "Good," Emily said. "Let's talk strategy." The group gathered in the living room, maps and sketches spread across the coffee table. Emily pointed at the layout of Frank's property. "They'll most likely come from the road," she began. "But we can't rule out the woods in the back. We need eyes everywhere." Travis spoke up. "I'll take the front with Jake. Melissa and Greg can cover the rear. Emily, you'll run point with Frank inside the house." Frank nodded. "What about weapons?" Emily pulled out a duffel bag and unzipped it, revealing batons, pepper spray, and zip ties. "We're not looking to kill anyone," she said firmly. "We just need to hold them off until the police get here." Frank's eyes narrowed. "And what if the police don't come in time?" Emily met his gaze. "Then we do whatever it takes to protect this place." Frank let the words hang in the air before nodding. "Good." As preparations continued, Frank found himself patrolling the property with Emily. They walked the perimeter, inspecting the defenses. "You're good at this," Frank said. Emily shrugged. "My dad taught me everything I know." Frank stopped and looked at her. "No, this isn't just training. You care. That's rare these days." Emily's face softened. "I guess I do. I know what it's like to feel outnumbered, to feel like no one's coming to help." Frank stared out at the woods. "I've felt that way more times than I can count." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not this time." By mid-afternoon, the property was transformed. Lights lined the fence, and improvised barriers blocked off the most vulnerable entry points. Emily's crew moved with the confidence of seasoned veterans, but Frank noticed something else: respect. They didn't just follow Emily, they believed in her. Frank's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of engines in the distance. His stomach tightened. Travis jogged up. "We've got company." Frank's heart pounded as he stepped onto the porch. Dust rose from the road as a convoy of motorcycles approached. They stopped just short of the property, their engines rumbling like thunder. Billy Reynolds dismounted first, his grin as cruel as ever. "Looks like you made some friends," Billy called out. "But friends won't save you." Frank stepped forward, his voice steady. "You're not welcome here, Reynolds." Billy's grin faltered for a moment before he laughed. "You really think these people can stop us?" Emily stepped beside Frank, her eyes locked on Billy. "Try us." Billy's eyes flicked to Emily, sizing her up. "You look tough, but this isn't your fight." Emily crossed her arms. "It is now." Billy's smile vanished. "You just made a big mistake." He turned and climbed back onto his bike. "We'll be back," he said, his voice dripping with menace. Frank watched as they rode away, the tension still thick in the air. "They're testing us," Emily said. "They'll be back tonight." Frank nodded. "Then we'll be ready." As dusk fell, the team checked the perimeter one last time. Frank stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. Emily joined him, handing him a flashlight. "Get some rest," she said. Frank shook his head. "Not tonight." She didn't argue. Instead, she sat beside him. "Whatever happens," Emily said, "we're in this together." Frank looked at her and nodded. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't standing alone. The night air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and pine as Frank walked the perimeter of his property. The motion sensors clicked softly in the distance, a subtle reminder that the lines were drawn and the battle was coming. Frank adjusted the flashlight in his hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. He paused near the old oak tree at the edge of the property, his eyes lingering on its twisted branches. It had been there since before he bought the house, standing tall through every storm, just like he had. But even trees fall eventually. The thought lingered in his mind as he turned back toward the house. Emily was waiting for him on the porch, her silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the floodlights. "Anything?" she asked. "Quiet," Frank said, though his voice carried little comfort. Emily nodded and leaned against the railing. She looked calm, but Frank could see the tension in her shoulders. "Ever been in a fight like this before?" Frank asked. Emily hesitated. "Not exactly like this. But close enough." Frank studied her for a moment. "Your father, he was the bravest man I ever knew." Emily smiled faintly. "He used to tell me about you. Said you were the one who kept him grounded when things got bad." Frank looked away, his throat tightening. "We all leaned on each other back then. It's what kept us alive." Emily's voice softened. "And it's what'll keep us alive now." Frank wanted to believe that, but the memories came rushing back, the gunfire, the screams, the faces of those he couldn't save. He gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. "Frank?" Emily's voice pulled him back. He exhaled sharply. "I'm fine. Just old ghosts." Emily stepped closer. "You don't have to carry this alone. Whatever happened back then, you made it through. And you'll make it through this, too." Frank met her gaze and saw the conviction in her eyes. For the first time in years, someone wasn't looking at him like he was fragile. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hours crawled by. Frank sat at the kitchen table, cleaning an old hunting knife he hadn't touched in years. Emily's crew rotated shifts outside, their movements precise and deliberate. But as the night stretched on, the silence grew heavier. Frank's mind wandered back to the war, the nights spent huddled in trenches, waiting for an attack that might never come. The fear was the same now, but this time, he wasn't a young soldier. This time, he wasn't sure if his body could keep up with his mind. He stood and walked to the window. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, distorting the shapes of trees and fences. He tightened his grip on the knife. Suddenly, a faint rustling caught his ear. Frank froze, his pulse quickening. He strained to see through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to shift and dance just out of reach. "Emily," he called, keeping his voice low. She appeared almost instantly, her hand resting on the baton strapped to her belt. "What is it?" "Something's out there," Frank said. Emily moved to the window, her eyes sharp as she scanned the yard. Then she spotted it, a figure darting through the trees. "Travis," she hissed into her radio. "We've got movement on the east side. Eyes up." Frank grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door, but Emily stepped in front of him. "Stay inside," she said firmly. "I can handle myself," Frank shot back. "I know you can, but I need you in here. If this goes sideways, someone has to protect the house." Frank hated it, but he nodded. Emily slipped out the door, her footsteps silent as she disappeared into the night. Minutes felt like hours. Frank paced the living room, his ears tuned to every creak and groan of the old house. Then he heard it, a scuffle, followed by a grunt of pain. Frank grabbed his knife and moved toward the back door just as Emily burst in, dragging a man by the collar of his jacket. "Caught him sneaking around the fence line," she said, shoving the man to the floor. The man groaned and looked up, his face bruised and bloodied. Frank recognized him immediately, one of Billy's crew. "Talk," Emily demanded. The man spat at her feet. "You're all dead." Frank stepped forward, his voice like steel. "Not tonight." The man's eyes flicked to Frank, and for the first time, Frank saw something other than defiance, fear. Emily pulled out her radio. "Tie him up. We'll deal with him later." As Travis secured the man, Emily turned to Frank. "This was just a test. They're coming." Frank's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better be ready." The first sign was the distant hum of engines. Frank sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of his hunting knife. The air inside the house felt stifling, weighed down by the tension building with every passing second. Emily stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the road leading to the property. The radio on her hip crackled to life. "Lights on the horizon," Travis reported. "Looks like at least a dozen bikes." Emily grabbed the radio. "Hold your positions. No one moves until I give the signal." Frank rose from his chair and crossed the room, his movements steadier than he expected. "Are we ready for this?" he asked. Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." Frank nodded and walked to the front door, peering through the small window. The headlights were closer now, their beams cutting through the night like searchlights. He could hear the roar of engines, loud, angry, and deliberate. "They want us scared," Emily said, joining him at the door. Frank's jaw tightened. They picked the wrong house. The motorcycles slowed as they reached the property line, their headlights sweeping across the yard and illuminating the defenses Emily's team had set up. The riders didn't stop. Instead, they fanned out, circling the house like predators testing their prey. Billy Reynolds was the last to dismount, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the porch. "Frank Sullivan," he called out, his voice booming. "Come on out and let's talk." Frank opened the door but didn't step outside. Emily flanked him, her hand resting on the baton strapped to her belt. "We've got nothing to talk about," Frank said, his voice steady. Billy's grin was as sharp as a knife. "I think we do. You see, I don't take kindly to being disrespected." He gestured to his men. "And neither do they." Frank's grip tightened around the doorframe. "This is my home. You're not taking it." Billy's grin faded. "You should have walked away when you had the chance, old man." He turned to his men and raised his hand. Engines roared to life, and the bikers surged forward. The first wave came fast. Spotlights flared to life, bathing the yard in blinding light. The motion sensors triggered alarms that wailed through the night, but the bikers didn't stop. They charged through the fence, tearing down barriers and kicking over obstacles. Travis and Jake stepped out from behind cover, their batons swinging. A biker lunged at Travis, but Travis sidestepped and drove his baton into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling. Jake took down another, twisting his arm and forcing him to the ground. Frank watched through the window, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to Emily. "They're pushing through too fast," he said. Emily grabbed her radio. "Fall back to the house." Travis and Jake retreated, slamming the door behind them. The bikers pounded against the walls, their shouts and curses echoing through the night. Emily locked eyes with Frank. "We need to hold this line." The door shuddered as someone rammed into it. Frank braced himself, his knife in hand. The wood splintered, and a biker burst through, swinging a tire iron. Frank dodged the first blow and drove the knife into the man's shoulder, forcing him back. Emily was there in an instant, knocking the biker out cold with a baton strike to the head. "Are you okay?" she asked. Frank nodded, his breathing heavy. "I've still got it." She grinned. "Good. We'll need it." Outside, the floodlights flickered and went dark. They cut the power. Travis yelled from the hallway. "Stay calm." Emily shouted back. "They can't see any better than we can now." Frank lit a lantern and handed it to Emily. Shadows danced across the walls as they moved through the house, securing doors and windows. Suddenly, glass shattered in the back room. Frank spun around, his knife raised. A biker climbed through the broken window, but before he could gain his footing, Frank tackled him to the ground. The two struggled, rolling across the floor. Frank's strength was fading, but he refused to let go. The biker swung wildly, but Frank ducked and slammed the man's head against the floorboards, knocking him unconscious. Emily appeared in the doorway, out of breath. "We're holding, but barely." Frank straightened. "Then let's finish this." The battle raged on, but the tides began to turn. Emily's team fought with precision, driving the bikers back inch by inch. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and the bikers scattered. Billy stood in the yard, his face twisted with rage as he watched his men flee. He turned back toward the house, locking eyes with Frank one last time. "This isn't over," he shouted before disappearing into the night. Frank lowered his knife, his hands shaking as the adrenaline wore off. Emily stepped beside him, her breath ragged. "We did it," she said. Frank didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, broken glass, overturned furniture, and bloodstains on the floor. He exhaled slowly. "For now," he said. Frank leaned against the wall, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The flashing red and blue lights outside spilled through the windows, painting the room in streaks of color. Emily stood beside him, her baton still clutched tightly in her hand. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now that the immediate danger had passed. Frank nodded, though his body betrayed him with a slight tremor. "I've been through worse," he said, forcing a smile. The front door burst open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside, their weapons drawn. Travis raised his hands in the air before one of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, barked, "Stand down." Emily stepped forward, lowering her baton. "We called this in. I'm Emily Carter, and this is Frank Sullivan. This is his property, and we've been defending it from an attack." The officer's eyes swept across the room, the shattered glass, overturned furniture, and unconscious bikers tied up on the floor. "What the hell happened here?" the officer asked. Frank straightened, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his bones. "We were attacked. They tried to take my home." The officer exchanged a look with her partner before lowering her weapon. "We've had complaints about Billy Reynolds and his crew before, but this is different." Emily stepped closer. "Reynolds is still out there. He ran when he heard the sirens." The officer nodded. "We'll find him." She gestured to her partner, who started radioing for backup. Frank exhaled slowly, letting himself lean back against the wall as the tension in his chest began to ease. An hour later, the house was swarming with police officers, paramedics, and neighbors who had gathered to see what had happened. Frank sat on the porch steps with a bandage wrapped around his arm, watching as the unconscious bikers were loaded into squad cars. Emily dropped down beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd. "They'll be back," Frank said quietly. Emily nodded. "People like Billy don't give up that easily." Frank turned to her. "Then we'll be ready." She smiled faintly. "You're not alone anymore, Frank." The words lingered between them, heavier than the night air. Frank swallowed hard, pushing back the lump forming in his throat. "Thank you," he said finally. Emily shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. We're not done." Just as the last police car pulled away, Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. He frowned, pulling it out and squinting at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through the line, cold and sharp. You think this is over, old man? Billy Reynolds' voice sent a chill down Frank's spine. I'll be back. And next time, I won't leave empty-handed. The line went dead. Frank lowered the phone, his hands tightening around it. Emily noticed his expression. Who was that? Billy, Frank said quietly. He's not done. Emily's jaw tightened. Then neither are we. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The sunlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating the damage left behind. Frank stood in the center of the living room, surveying the mess. Emily entered, carrying a toolbox and a roll of duct tape. We'll start with the windows, she said. Frank chuckled softly. Never thought I'd be patching up my house with duct tape and borrowed tools. Emily grinned. Hey, it's a temporary fix. The important thing is, we're still standing. Frank looked at her, his expression softening. You didn't have to stay. Emily shrugged. I'm not going anywhere until this is finished. And neither is my crew. Outside, Travis and Jake were already working on repairing the fence, their movements quick and purposeful. Frank exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the house wasn't just walls and a roof, it was a fortress, and he wasn't defending it alone. By midday, the property was starting to look less like a battlefield and more like a home again. The windows were covered, the fences repaired, and the floodlights tested and reinstalled. Frank stood on the porch, leaning on the railing as Emily joined him. You're ready for him, aren't you? She asked. Frank's gaze didn't waver. I'm ready for whatever comes next. Emily smiled. Good. Because something tells me this isn't over. Frank allowed himself a small smile. Let him come. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank sat in his armchair, staring at the photo of Margaret. He touched the frame gently, his heart steady. I'll keep us safe, he whispered. Outside, Emily's crew patrolled the property, their silhouettes moving through the fading light. Frank closed his eyes, the sounds of their footsteps fading into the background. He wasn't alone anymore. And this fight wasn't over. Frank sat on the porch, the rocking chair creaking softly beneath him as the sun dipped below the horizon. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, but his eyes were fixed on the distant tree line. It had been 2 days since the attack, but the tension in his chest refused to loosen. Emily stepped out onto the porch, her boots thudding lightly against the wooden planks. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Frank before settling into the chair beside him. Still keeping watch? She asked. Frank took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest. Old habits. Emily leaned back, staring out at the yard. The fence had been repaired, the lights reinstalled, and the broken windows patched up. But no amount of fixing could erase the memory of the chaos that had unfolded here. You think he'll come back? Frank asked. Emily's eyes narrowed. Not right away. Reynolds took a hit. He'll need time to regroup, but he's not the type to walk away. Frank nodded. That's what worries me. Emily turned to face him. We'll be ready. No matter when, or how, he shows up. Frank offered a small smile, but the weight on his shoulders lingered. Later that afternoon, Frank heard the sound of a car approaching. He straightened in his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife resting on the table beside him. But as the car pulled up, his grip loosened. It was his son, Tom. Tom stepped out, looking uncertain as he adjusted his jacket. He had the same sharp jawline and determined eyes as Frank, but there was hesitation in his posture. Frank rose slowly, his heart pounding. It had been years since they'd spoken face to face. Dad, Tom said, stopping a few feet away. Frank swallowed hard. Tom. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Tom stepped closer. I heard what happened, he said. The whole town's talking about it. Frank crossed his arms. And? Tom let out a breath. And I should have been here. Frank's eyes softened, but he kept his voice steady. You're here now. Tom looked away, guilt etched into his features. I let too much time go by. After Mom died, I didn't know how to deal with it. And then you. Frank cut him off. You don't have to explain. I wasn't exactly easy to talk to back then. Tom looked back at him. I want to fix this, Dad. I want to help. Frank felt his throat tighten. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. Then let's fix it, Frank said. Tom nodded, and for the first time in years, Frank felt the wall between them begin to crumble. That evening, Frank and Tom worked side by side, reinforcing the back fence and adding extra lighting near the tree line. They spoke little, but the silence felt comfortable, like the beginning of something new. Emily watched from the porch, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Looks like progress, she said as Frank approached. Frank glanced back at Tom, who was testing the floodlights. It's a start. Emily folded her arms. You should tell him what this fight means to you. He deserves to know. Frank hesitated but nodded. I will. When the time's right. Later that night, Frank sat in his armchair, flipping through an old photo album. The pictures were faded, but the memories were sharp. Margaret on their wedding day, Tom as a boy running through the fields, and the men he had served with, their faces frozen in time. Tom entered the room, pausing at the sight of the album. Is that from the war? Tom asked. Frank nodded and motioned for him to sit. These are the men I served with. Joe Carter's in here too. Tom leaned closer, studying the photos. Emily told me about her dad. Sounds like he was a lot like you. Frank smiled faintly. He was one of the best. Tom hesitated. Why didn't you ever talk about this stuff? Frank closed the album. Because it hurt too much. Losing people you care about, it changes you. Tom met his eyes. I get that now. Frank placed a hand on Tom's arm. I just didn't want to lose you too. Tom's expression softened. You won't. The next morning, Frank stood in the yard as Emily and her crew prepared to leave. Travis shook his hand firmly. If you need us again, we'll be here, Travis said. Frank nodded. I'm counting on it. Emily lingered, her helmet tucked under her arm. You'll be okay? Frank smirked. I'm tougher than I look. Emily grinned. I never doubted that. She climbed onto her bike, and the crew roared off down the road, leaving Frank standing in the morning light. Tom stepped up beside him. So, what now? Tom asked. Frank looked out at the horizon, his expression resolute. Now we wait, Frank said. And when he comes back, we'll be ready. Tom nodded. Together. Frank smiled, the tension in his chest finally easing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was living. Frank stood on the porch at sunrise, the soft golden light stretching across the fields. The world seemed peaceful, but he knew better. Beneath the calm surface, trouble was brewing. Billy Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. His fingers traced the handle of his hunting knife as he replayed Billy's words over and over in his mind. This isn't over. Emily's crew was gone now, and the house felt quieter, too quiet. The reinforced fences, spotlights, and alarms were still in place, but Frank knew it wouldn't be enough if Billy decided to come back with more men. He turned as Tom stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Couldn't sleep? Tom asked, handing one to his father. Frank shook his head. Not with Reynolds out there. Tom leaned against the railing. We're ready for him, Dad. He won't catch us off guard again. Frank nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he sipped his coffee and stared out at the horizon, his mind drifting back to the war, the endless waiting, the uncertainty, the fear. But back then, he wasn't waiting alone. By mid-morning, Frank decided to test the perimeter again. He and Tom walked the fence line, checking each sensor and making sure the lights were in working order. You sure about this? Tom asked as they tightened a loose panel. Frank raised an eyebrow. About what? Staying here. Fighting this fight. Frank's gaze hardened. This is my home. Your mother and I built this place with our own hands. I'm not letting anyone take it. Tom nodded, but Frank could see the concern in his eyes. We're not leaving, Frank added. Not now. Not ever. That afternoon, Emily called. I've got news, she said. One of Billy's men talked. Frank sat forward in his chair. And? They're regrouping outside of town, Emily said. Reynolds is planning something bigger, maybe tonight. Frank's jaw clenched. We're ready. I'll bring my crew back, Emily offered. No, Frank said firmly. You've done enough already. Frank. I mean it, he interrupted. This is my fight. I appreciate what you've done, but I need to finish this on my own. There was a long pause before Emily spoke again. Call me if you need me. Frank hung up, his heart pounding. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the house seemed to shrink as darkness crept in. Tom paced in the living room, double-checking the locks while Frank stood by the window. They'll come soon, Frank said. Tom turned. We should call Emily. We can't do this alone. Frank shook his head. We're not alone. Tom frowned. What do you mean? Frank didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. 30 minutes later, headlights appeared in the distance, not motorcycles this time, but trucks and cars. Tom looked out the window, his eyes widening as vehicles lined up along the driveway. Men and women began climbing out, their faces weathered but determined. Who are they? Tom asked. Frank smiled. Old friends. One by one, they approached the house, veterans, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard Frank's story. Some carried tools, others held makeshift weapons, but all of them carried the same resolve in their eyes. Emily was among them. I knew you'd call, she said, smirking as she stepped onto the porch. Frank grinned. You didn't think I'd let you have all the fun, did you? The rumble of motorcycles broke the night's silence. Billy Reynolds and his crew roared up the road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Frank stood in the yard, flanked by Tom, Emily, and the others. Billy dismounted, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the crowd. This is your last chance, Sullivan, Billy called out. Walk away. Frank stepped forward, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. Billy smirked. Then I guess we'll have to make you. He raised his hand, and his men surged forward. The fight erupted like thunder. Frank held his ground as chaos unfolded around him. Tom fought beside him, swinging a baton Emily had given him earlier. The veterans moved with precision, holding the bikers back with sheer determination and experience. Frank took down one man, then another, his instincts sharper than he thought they'd be after all these years. Nearby, Emily knocked a biker to the ground, shouting for others to hold the line. Billy spotted Frank and charged toward him, wielding a crowbar. Frank ducked the first swing and drove his shoulder into Billy's chest, knocking him back. But Billy recovered quickly, slamming the crowbar against Frank's arm. Pain shot through Frank, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Billy by the collar and threw him to the ground. This ends now, Frank growled. Billy scrambled to his feet, but before he could attack again, police sirens blared in the distance. The bikers froze, their confidence faltering as the flashing lights approached. By the time the dust settled, the bikers were in cuffs, and Billy was being led away in the back of a squad car. Frank leaned against the porch railing, his arm bandaged and sore but his spirit unbroken. Emily walked up, smiling. Told you we'd be ready. Frank chuckled. You were right. Tom joined them, his arm around Frank's shoulder. You're one tough old man, Tom said. Frank grinned. Guess it runs in the family. Later that night, Frank sat in his chair, looking at Margaret's photo. We did it, he whispered. We're safe. Outside, Tom and Emily laughed as they shared stories with the neighbors who had come to help. Frank closed his eyes, feeling, for the first time in years, truly at peace. And as the sounds of laughter filled the air, Frank knew this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the start of something new.